The rain fell steadily over the Appalachian hills, a gray curtain draped across the forest. In the middle of it all, tucked between dark pine trees, it stood an old wooden cabin. Its roof sagged in places, patched with tin sheets that clattered each time the wind picked up. Smoke crept from a crooked chimney, rising only a few feet before the rain broke it apart. Inside, the cabin was dim. A lantern burned on the table, casting a dull yellow glow that reached just far enough to make the shadows look alive. The wood stove popped as the fire inside struggled against damp logs. The smell of wet ash and old timber filled the air. In the silence between the fire and the rain, another sound marked the passing of time, the slow, steady tick of a wall clock. Henry Walker sat in a rocking chair near the stove. His shoulders were hunched, his hands resting heavy on his knees. 76 years old, and most of those years now pressed down on his body. Each breath was labored, each motion deliberate. He rocked slowly, the chair creaking beneath his weight, the sound blending with the clock like a tired duet. This was Henry's world. Quiet and unchanging, the cabin was more than a house. He had built it himself decades ago, back when his hands were strong and his back was straight. He remembered cutting the first logs, hammering nails through green wood, and standing proud when the roof went up. That was another lifetime. Now the cabin stood as a witness to what remained of him, a man who had grown old in the company of silence. On the mantel above the stove lay a photograph. It was turned face down, the frame scratched and the glass cracked at the corner. Dust covered its surface, but Henry's eyes found it often. He stared at it for a long time before reaching forward with a trembling hand. His fingertips brushed the edge of the frame. For a moment he lifted it, his hand shaking not from weakness but from the weight of memory. He didn't turn it over. He couldn't. He already knew what was on the other side, the face of his son, Daniel, captured in a photo taken more than 20 years ago. Henry's jaw tightened. He set the photograph back down. Still face down, beside it, half hidden in shadow, was a dagger. The blade was dull now, its handle cracked from years of neglect. Henry had carried it when he was younger, during his service days. Back then, it was sharp, clean, and full of meaning. Now, like the photograph, it was only a reminder of strength that had faded, of battles long finished, and of a man he no longer was. Henry leaned back into the chair, his eyes drifting toward the small table beside him. A stack of envelopes sat there, some opened, most not. He pulled one free, the papers soft from being handled too often. Red letters on the front read overdue, property taxes, medical bills, notices from the bank. He dropped it back on the pile, the papers sliding across the table and falling to the floor. What was the point of opening them anymore? The debts stacked higher than he could climb, and no matter how much he tried, there was no way out. For Henry, those bills were more than just paper. They were enemies, quiet but relentless, closing in on him every day. He could fight storms, sickness, and even loneliness, but against debt, he had nothing left to give. He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them against the failing fire. The skin was dry, lined with cracks. His knuckles were swollen, stiff with age. He stared at them for a long time, as if the hands themselves held the story of his life. Hands that had built a home, raised a child, and pushed that same child away. Because in truth, Henry's loneliness wasn't just about age. It wasn't just about living in the woods. It was about Daniel. 20 years had passed since the night his son walked out of this cabin. The memory played in Henry's mind whether he wanted it to or not. The storm outside that night had been much like the one tonight. Rain lashing the roof, wind clawing at the windows. Inside, the storm had been worse. Father and son, shouting words they couldn't take back. Daniel's voice filled with anger, Henry's with pride. And then the door slamming, the footsteps fading, the sound of a truck pulling away. Henry had stood in that same spot, refusing to follow. He had told himself it was Daniel's choice, that the boy needed to learn. But the truth was simpler and harsher. Henry had been too proud to call him back. That pride had cost him 2 decades of silence. Henry pressed a hand to his face, dragging it down slowly. His eyes stung, but he didn't cry. He hadn't cried in years. Instead, he whispered, the words barely leaving his lips. I was wrong, he said. His voice was cracked and thin. God help me, I was wrong. The cabin gave no reply. The rain outside carried on, steady and merciless. The photograph lay where he had left it, face down, silent and accusing. Henry rocked gently in his chair, the motion slow, the creaking wood filling the space between thoughts. The fire collapsed into embers, leaving the cabin darker than before. Shadows stretched across the walls, deepening the sense of emptiness. His eyes moved to the clock. The ticking was louder now. each second marking not just time, but loss. He thought about Daniel's face, how young he had been when he left, how stubborn. Henry wondered what his son looked like now. Older, certainly, hardened, maybe, but Henry had no answers. For 20 years, the silence between them had been unbroken. He leaned back, pulling the blanket tighter around his shoulders. The fabric smelled of smoke and old wool. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the rhythm of the rain settle into him. Outside these hills, life went on. Families gathered at dinner tables. Children laughed. Futures were built, but not here. Not in this cabin. Here, there was only Henry Walker. An old man, a pile of debts, a photograph he couldn't bear to look at, and silence, always silence. He let out a long breath, fogging the air in front of him. Daniel, wherever you are, I wish things had been different. The words disappeared into the cabin, swallowed whole by the stillness. Henry stayed in the chair, rocking, listening to the storm until it became part of him, and though he didn't know it, the silence that ruled his life was already beginning to crack. Fate was moving, quietly, far beyond the hills, and soon everything would change. The storm outside wasn't just weather, it was memory. Rain lashed against the cabin, each drop hitting the roof like tiny hammers. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, moaning and howling as if the mountain itself was alive. Inside, Henry Walker sat by the fire, staring at the flames, but he wasn't really here. Nights like this always pulled him back to that night, the night his son left. The fire flickered, and suddenly the cabin around him seemed to dissolve, swallowed by the storm. And Henry was no longer a 76-year-old man in a worn chair. He was younger, stronger, but just as angry. The memory unfolded like a film he couldn't stop watching. The cabin groaned under the pressure of the storm. Water leaked through a small crack near the window, dripping into a tin bucket Henry had placed there earlier. The floorboards rattled with each gust of wind. At the kitchen table, Henry paced in circles, a half-empty bottle of wine in his hand. His knuckles were white, his face flushed red from both drink and fury. Daniel stood at the front door. He was tall, lean, and restless, 20 years old, with the kind of reckless energy only the young carry. His backpack was strapped tight, his boots laced. He was ready. "You're not leaving this house tonight," Henry said, his voice rough, commanding. "You'll kill yourself out there in this storm." Daniel's jaw tightened. His hand gripped the doorknob, but he didn't turn it yet. His eyes locked on his father's. "I'd rather face the storm than stay here another day. You've been choking me my whole life. I can't breathe in this place." Henry slammed his fist against the table. The glass sitting there toppled over and shattered, spraying shards across the wooden floor. Red wine spilled like blood, seeping into the cracks. "Ungrateful," he shouted. "I worked my bones to dust for you, for this family, and you call that choking?" Daniel's voice cracked as he yelled back. "You never saw me, Dad, not once. You saw a kid you could order around, a failure waiting to happen, but never me." Henry's chest heaved. He grabbed his truck keys from the counter and hurled them onto the floor with a metallic clang. "Then go find your perfect life out there. Take the damn truck if you want, but if you walk out that door tonight, don't you ever come back." Lightning flashed, lighting Daniel's face. His eyes burned with rage, but beneath the fire was hurt, deep, raw hurt. "You'll regret this, old man," he said, his voice trembling. The words hit Henry like a blade, but pride forced him to stand tall. He folded his arms. Staring back coldly, Daniel bent down, snatched the keys from the floor, and swung the door open. The storm roared inside instantly, rain whipping across the wooden floor. He hesitated for half a second, then stepped out into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind him with a thunderous crack, and just like that, the cabin was silent. No voice, no footsteps, only the storm and the shattering of Henry's heartbeat. Henry stood frozen in the middle of the room, his hand twitched at his side, still burning from the force of slamming the keys down. His eyes stared at the door as if Daniel might walk back in at any second, but he didn't. The rain pounded harder, soaking the porch outside. Henry finally moved. Stumbling toward the table, he crouched down, picking up pieces of broken glass. A sharp shard cut into his palm, and blood trickled across his skin. He didn't even flinch. He dropped the glass into the sink and stood there, gripping the counter with shaking hands. The only sound was the storm outside and the drip of water from the ceiling. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Henry wasn't sure. Finally, he opened the door. Stepping onto the porch, the wind tore at his clothes, and rain stung his face. In the distance, down the dirt road, he caught the faint glow of headlights disappearing into the sheets of rain. His chest tightened as the truck vanished into the night, swallowed whole by the storm. Henry wanted to call out, to shout Daniel's name, to run after him. But his pride anchored him to the porch, heavy and unmovable, so he stood there, silent, until the lights were gone, and then there was nothing, nothing but rain. When Henry finally went back inside, the cabin felt different, empty, hollow. The air was heavy, as if the house itself knew what had just been lost. He poured the rest of the wine into the sink, staring at the dark liquid as it swirled down the drain. For the first time in his life he realized what silence really was. The crackle of fire pulled Henry back to now. He was older, slower, his hands shook more these days, and his back ached when he stood too long, but some things hadn't changed. The memory was still sharp, too sharp. He could see Daniel's face, hear his voice, feel the slam of that door as if it had just happened. Henry leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. His voice was barely a whisper. I told him not to come back, and he listened. The clock ticked on the wall, steady and cold. 20 years had passed. 20 years without a word. 20 years without a son. The camera would linger here in silence, letting the weight of it sink in for the listener. The narrator's voice would cut in, slow and deliberate. From that stormy night, the cabin didn't say a song. It lost laughter, it lost warmth, it lost the sound of a future, and Henry Walker lost the only family he had. Henry leaned back, staring into the fire. The storm outside howled, but inside it was quieter than ever, and that silence would haunt him for the rest of his life. The rain had eased up on the mountain roads. The wipers brushed across the windshield in a steady rhythm, clearing streaks of mist that clung to the glass. Inside the car, the heater hummed softly. Emily kept her hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead, in the back seat. Little Noah laughed at nothing in particular, just the sound of his own voice bouncing off the windows. The radio played low, an old country tune that seemed to belong to the road itself. Emily smiled faintly and glanced in the rearview mirror at her son. "You're going to meet your grandpa, little one," she whispered. Maybe he's not the monster Dad said he was." Noah responded with another giggle, waving his tiny arms as if he understood. Emily let out a shaky laugh of her own, though it carried a weight she couldn't shake. Miles away, on the porch of a weathered cabin, Henry Walker sat in his rocking chair. The storm had passed, leaving the forest dripping and quiet. He could hear the distant drip of rainwater sliding off the roof, the creak of the chair beneath him, and the faint buzz of cicadas waking up after the rain. In his hand was something he rarely touched, an old cell phone. The screen glowed dimly in the gray light. A notification blinked for Henry frowned. Hardly anyone ever called him. Most days the phone stayed on the shelf, half dead, but tonight, curiosity got the better of him. He pressed the button and lifted it to his ear. The voice on the other end made his chest tighten. "Hi, Mr. Walker, Henry. My name is Emily. I don't know if you remember my name, but you might remember my dad's, Daniel. I'm his daughter." Henry froze, his breath caught in his throat. For 20 years, no one had dared to say that name in his presence. "Daniel," the voice continued, gentle but firm. I thought maybe it's time you knew about me. I thought maybe it's time knowing my son knew you. I know things ended badly between you and my dad. I know he never came back, but I want to believe people can change. I want to believe families don't have to stay broken forever. We're coming to see you, Henry. I hope that's okay." The message ended with the faint background sound of a baby cooing. Henry lowered the phone, staring out at the wet trees. For a long moment, he didn't move. He couldn't. Back on the road, Emily's car climbed a steep hill. She glanced at the GPS mounted on the dashboard, its glowing screen showing a winding line through the Appalachian backroads. She sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. "You'll like him, Noah," she murmured. "He's probably grumpy, probably stubborn, but maybe, just maybe, he's been waiting for this." Noah let out a squeal, tossing his toy across the car seat. Emily chuckled and reached a hand back briefly to adjust his blanket. For the first time in a long time, she felt a strange pull in her chest, not fear, not anger, but hope. On the porch, Henry leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The voicemail still echoed in his mind. Emily, Daniel's daughter, his granddaughter. He shook his head slowly. Why now? After all these years, his eyes wandered to the fireplace inside. On the mantel, face down, was the old photograph he had never dared to look at again. The family he had lost, the choice he had made, for so long. His only companions had been silence and a growing pile of bills. They were reminders he was alive, but alone. Now something else had entered his life. Uninvited. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but something smaller, fragile. A faint flicker of hope he hadn't felt in decades. The car wound deeper into the hills. Emily turned down the radio and spoke again. almost as if confessing to the empty air. Dad used to say you were impossible. He told me stories about the fights, about how you never listened. But you know what? He also told me how much he wanted to prove himself to you. That part he never admitted until it was too late. She blinked hard, eyes stinging, but she kept driving. I don't want Noah to grow up with those same walls between us. He deserves to know where he came from. He deserves a family, even if it's complicated. Her words faded into the hum of the road, into the rhythm of tires against wet pavement. At the cabin, Henry rose slowly from his chair and stepped inside. He set the phone on the table beside the bills that cluttered his life: property tax notices, overdue medical charges, final warnings from the bank. His hand hovered above the photo on the mantel. Trembling, he flipped it over. The faces stared back. A younger Henry, his late wife, and Daniel smiling, defiant, alive. Henry swallowed hard. He hadn't looked at this picture in 20 years. And now, a new face was coming into his life. A granddaughter, a great-grandson. Strangers, yet blood. He sat back down, staring at the photo, then at the phone. For the first time, the silence around him felt less like a punishment and more like a waiting room. Something was about to change. Out on the road, Emily's car curved along a narrow stretch of mountain highway. The rain began again, soft at first, then heavier. She flicked the wipers to their highest setting, leaning forward in her seat. Almost there, Noah, she whispered. Almost there. The baby giggled again, clutching his blanket tight. Emily smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't know what kind of man her grandfather was. She didn't know what kind of reception awaited, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't turn back now. Back at the cabin, Henry closed his eyes. The sound of the rain returned, steady and relentless. He thought of Daniel. He thought of the words shouted across the kitchen 20 years ago, words that couldn't be taken back. But he also thought of Emily's voice, breaking through 2 decades of silence. For years, his life had been measured by unpaid bills and long nights alone. Tonight it felt different. Tonight the silence had been broken not by anger, but by a young woman's courage. And in that fragile space, Henry allowed himself to feel something he thought was gone forever, a small, uncertain flicker of hope. The mountain road was darker than Emily expected. The rain had picked up again, heavier now, the kind of rain that blurred the world into gray streaks. Her wipers worked non-stop, squeaking as they fought to keep the windshield clear. In the back seat, Noah was half asleep, his little hand clinging to the corner of his blanket. Every few minutes he let out a small laugh, as if dreaming of something funny. The sound gave Emily strength. She gripped the wheel tighter and leaned forward, trying to see through the storm. Almost there. Noah, she whispered. Just a little longer. A few miles ahead, a semi-truck rumbled down the same winding road. Inside the cab, Alan Parker blinked hard, fighting the weight in his eyelids. He had been driving for 12 hours straight. His thermos of coffee sat empty on the seat beside him. The radio crackled with static. Alan smacked the knob, gave up, and rubbed his face with one hand. He yawned so wide it hurt. Come on, stay awake, he muttered to himself. Just a few more miles, but his head was heavy. The white lines on the wet asphalt blurred together. His hand slipped on the wheel. The storm wasn't helping. Rain hammered the windshield. Thunder rolled in the distance, and the wipers couldn't keep up. Alan shook his head and tried to focus, but every muscle in his body screamed for rest. Back at the cabin, Henry Walker sat at his kitchen table, staring at the phone he had placed there hours earlier. Emily's voicemail still echoed in his mind. Daniel's daughter, his granddaughter, and a great-grandson he had never seen. He rubbed his forehead, torn between disbelief and something he hadn't felt in years. Longing. The wind rattled the window panes. The rain drummed on the roof. Henry leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time in decades, he prayed. He didn't even know what for. Maybe forgiveness, maybe strength, maybe just the chance to see them before it was too late. On the road, Emily's GPS said 20 minutes to go. She exhaled, almost relieved. The mountain curves were tight, but she had driven worse. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the road ahead for a split second. She caught sight of the steep drop on one side, the rock wall on the other. It made her heart pound. In the back, Noah stirred. He whined softly, eyes fluttering open. Emily reached a hand back for comfort. It's okay, baby, mommy's right here. We're gonna be fine. Her voice was calm, but her stomach knotted. She turned her eyes forward against in time to see the glare of headlights cutting through the storm. Alan's truck barreled down the hill. His eyelids closed for just a second too long. When they opened, he saw Emily's small car in front of him, closer than it should have been. Damn it. Alan slammed the brakes. The tires screamed against the wet asphalt. The massive trailer fit Sliding across the narrow lane, Emily's eyes went wide. She jerked the wheel to the right. The car swerved, tires skidding on the slick road. The sound of Noah's cry filled the car. For a heartbeat, everything slowed. The lights, the rain, the sound of the truck's horn frozen in time. Then came the crash. Metal tore against metal. Glass shattered. The truck's weight crushed the small car, forcing it into the guardrail. The sound was deafening, a violent explosion of noise that echoed through the valley. Henry jolted upright in his cabin, heart pounding. The storm outside roared, but this time he thought he heard something else in the distance. A sound carried on the window crash, far away but powerful. He stood, staring out the window at the dark ridge. The forest gave him no answers, only rain, wind, and silence. Back on the road, steam hissed from the wreckage. The truck sat jackknifed across the lane, its front end smashed into the guardrail. Alan stumbled out of the cab, drenched in rain, eyes wide with shock. Oh God, he ran toward the mangled car, hands trembling. Inside, Emily was motionless, pinned by the twisted frame. Her eyes were closed, her body limp. No, Alan tried to pull at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Flames sparked near the engine. He staggered back, panicked. Then he heard it, a cry, weak, muffled, but alive. Alan dropped to his knees, searching the back seat. Through the shattered glass, he saw Noah covered in blood and rain, but moving, still breathing. Alan reached in desperately, cutting his hands on the shards. He tried to pull the baby out, but the seatbelt held tight. His fingers fumbled, slick with rain and sweat. The fire grew, smoke filled the air. Alan coughed and stumbled back again, eyes stinging. He couldn't do it. He couldn't save them. He staggered to the side of the road, hands on his head, whispering through tears, I'm so sorry, and then he ran. The forest was dark, but not silent. From the shadows, a figure moved, a German shepherd with scars along its muzzle and a military tag still clinging to its collar. Shadow had been wandering these woods for months, a forgotten service dog without a master. The crash drew him like a signal. His ears perked. He bounded toward the wreckage, paws splashing through mud. He reached the car and barked, circling the wreck until he found the back window blown out. His nose caught the scent. Blood, fear, and a baby. Noah whimpered, his cry weak. Shadow jumped into the wreckage, teeth snapping at the seatbelt until it tore free. He grabbed Noah's blanket in his mouth and pulled, dragging the baby gently out of the car. The fire behind them flared higher, sparks flying into the rain. Shadow leapt down, carrying Noah to the wet ground. He stood over the child, barking loud into the storm, guarding him with every muscle in his body. Miles away, Henry sat back down, unaware of what had just happened on the mountain road, but something in his chest stirred again. That same fragile thing he felt when he heard Emily's voicemail. He didn't know why, but he whispered into the empty cabin, please let them get here safe. The storm hadn't let up. Rain poured over the mountains like a curtain, turning dirt into rivers of mud. The twisted wreck of Emily's car still hissed and smoked on the roadside, flames dying under the downpour. Shadow stood guard, his fur soaked, ears high, body tense. Noah cried weakly beneath him, wrapped in his damp blanket. The dog lowered his head and nudged the baby gently, as if reassuring him, you're not alone. Shadow barked, deep and sharp, the sound cutting through the storm. He barked again, louder this time, calling into the night. Half a mile away, headlights cut through the rain. A rescue truck crept along the slippery road. Inside sat Miller Thompson, a seasoned search and rescue volunteer. With two younger team members beside him, they had been called out after reports of a crash up the mountain, possibly involving a semi. Miller's eyes were sharp, scanning every bend in the road he had been on. Dozens of calls like this, but the storm made everything harder. Keep your eyes peeled, he told his team. If that rig went down, we won't see much until we're right on top of it. Then he heard it, a faint sound over the rain. A bark, short, desperate, carrying through the storm. Stop the truck, Miller barked. The driver hit the brakes. The vehicle skidded slightly before coming to a halt. They rolled down the windows, and there it was again, closer now. Shadow barked until his throat was raw. His ears twitched at the sound of engines drawing near. Then, headlights washed over the scene. The rescue truck pulled up, brakes squealing. Miller jumped out first, rain soaking his jacket. His flashlight beam cut across the wreckage and then he froze. Jesus, he muttered. The car was mangled beyond recognition. The cab of the semi lodged into the guardrail, and standing in the mud, guarding a tiny child, was a German shepherd. The dog growled low as the rescuers approached, his body over the baby, his teeth bared easy. Boy, Miller said calmly, kneeling low. His flashlight beam softened, his voice gentle. We're here to help. It's okay. Shadow didn't move at first. His body trembled with fear and adrenaline, but his eyes locked on Miller's. Then Noah cried again, louder this time, as if answering. Shadow winced, looked down at the baby, then back at the rescuer. Slowly, he stepped aside. "Good boy," Miller whispered. He motioned for the medic. "Get the kid." The young medic hurried over, scooping Noah into a blanket. The baby was soaked, shivering, but alive. "Vitals are weak, but he's breathing," the medic reported. Miller nodded, relief in his chest. He looked at the dog again. Shadow stood close, watching every move, unwilling to leave. "Bring him too," Miller said firmly. "Dogs saved this kid's life." As the team worked, Alan Parker stumbled from the tree line. His face was pale, eyes wide with shock. "I tried," he stammered. "I tried to get them out, but," his voice broke. She didn't make it." Miller's jaw tightened. He glanced at the car, flames hissing as rain snuffed them out. He knew the truth before Alan said it. "Sit him down," Miller ordered. One of his team guided Alan toward the truck. The medic returned, shaking his head. "The driver's right. The woman, she's gone." For a moment, the storm was the only sound. Miller lowered his flashlight. He didn't know who she was or where she had been going, but she had left behind a child. He turned back to the medic. "Get the boy to the hospital." Fast. Hours later, the hospital lights hummed against the silence. Noah lay in a small crib, wires connected to machines that beeped softly, measuring his breathing and heart rate. Nurses checked on him every few minutes, adjusting blankets and whispering to each other. In the waiting room, Miller sat with Shadow at his feet. The dog hadn't left since the rescue. His fur was still damp, his body tense, but his eyes never strayed far from the door leading to Noah's room. Miller stroked the dog's head absent-mindedly. "Who are you, boy? Where'd you come from?" Shadow didn't answer, of course. He only lay down with a sigh, ears still perked for any sound. Back at the cabin, Henry Walker sat awake long past midnight. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened. He stared at the phone, half expecting it to ring, half fearing it would. He rose and paced the room, the old floorboards creaking under his boots. Finally, he stepped out onto the porch. The storm had faded to a drizzle. The forest was silent again, except for the distant roll of thunder. Henry lit his lantern and held it out over the dark trees. As if searching for an answer, his chest ached with unease. At the hospital, a nurse approached Miller. "Do we know who to contact for the baby?" Miller shook his head. "Not yet. We'll run the plates from the car, but it may take time. He can't wait for that. He needs family." The nurse nodded, glancing at Shadow curled near the door. "Looks like he already has a guardian." Miller chuckled softly, though his heart was heavy. "Yeah, maybe so." By dawn, the news reached the small sheriff's office. They identified Emily Carter from her license, and with that, they identified her father, Daniel Carter, which meant they also knew who the baby's grandfather was. Back at the cabin, Henry's phone finally rang. He stared at the caller ID, the sheriff's number blinking. His hand shook as he picked it up. "Mr. Walker," the voice said gently. "I'm sorry to bring bad news. There was an accident last night. Your granddaughter Emily didn't make it, but her son, your great-grandson, he's alive. He's in the county hospital now." Henry's knees nearly gave out. He gripped the edge of the table, his breath shallow. "Emily, gone." Before he could even meet her, but the boy alive. Henry's voice cracked as he whispered, "What's his name?" "Noah," the sheriff said. "His name's Noah." Henry closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, tears rolled freely down his weathered face. The hospital waiting room was painted in soft beige, but nothing about it felt warm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A vending machine hummed in the corner. The smell of disinfectant lingered in the air. It was the kind of place where time slowed down, where every tick of the clock only made the silence heavier. Henry Walker sat in one of the plastic chairs, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He hadn't been in a hospital for years, not since his wife had passed, and now here he was again. He had been called after the accident. The sheriff told him the truth. Emily Carter, his granddaughter, was gone. Her little boy had survived. His name was Noah. The words still didn't feel real. Granddaughter. He had never met either of them, but the bloodline was his. The pain that should have been mixed with joy was crushing him instead. He had lost a granddaughter he never even had the chance to know. Through the glass window of the nursery, Henry could see Noah in a small hospital crib, bandaged lightly, but alive, breathing, innocent. A miracle in the middle of tragedy. Henry pressed his palm against the glass, his throat tight. For so long, his house had been silent. For so long, he believed he had no family left. But here was proof, flesh and blood, his blood. And then the sound came, the squeak of boots against the linoleum floor. a voice he hadn't heard in 20 years. "Dad." Henry froze, slowly, almost afraid to turn. He looked over his shoulder. Daniel stood there, older, worn down, but unmistakable. His once fiery eyes looked tired now, shadowed by regret. His shoulders carried years of weight. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just stared at each other, two men, bound by blood but divided by decades of silence. Finally, Henry's voice cracked. "You came." Daniel swallowed hard. His voice was low. "I heard about Emily, about the accident. I couldn't stay away." The name hung in the air like a ghost. Emily, Daniel's daughter, Henry's granddaughter, gone. Henry's hand shook. He wanted to stand, to shout, to embrace his son, to curse him, to forgive him all at once. But instead, he said the only words he could manage. She had a boy. His name's Noah. He's alive." Daniel's eyes shifted to the glass window. He saw the child inside, hooked up to small machines, but still breathing. His lips trembled. "My son's boy." Henry's gaze sharpened. "Our blood, Daniel. Ours." The weight of the past 20 years settled between them like a heavy stone. Daniel stepped closer. He looked at his father, really looked at him. The wrinkles were deeper now, the beard whiter, the hands older, but behind the age. Daniel saw the same man he once hated, once feared, once abandoned. "I thought about this day," Daniel admitted, his voice raw. "Every damn day, but I never knew how to come back." And now his words broke. "Now Emily's gone, and all that's left is this boy, and I don't deserve him." Henry's jaw tightened. "Don't say that. You're his father. You do what fathers are supposed to do." Daniel's eyes burned, "Like you did with me." The words cut deep, sharper than any knife. The years melted away, and suddenly they were back in that cabin. On that stormy night, voices raised, fists slammed, words that could never be taken back. Henry's chest heaved. "I was wrong that night." The admission shocked them both. Henry had never said it aloud, not in 20 years. Not to himself, not to God, not to anyone. But here it was, breaking the silence. "I let my pride destroy us," Henry whispered. "I let my anger drive you out, and I hated myself for it every damn day. But I was too stubborn to call you back, too proud to beg. And now it's too late for Emily." Daniel's eyes glistened. He turned away, pressing his hand to the window, staring at Noah. His voice cracked. "Do you know what it feels like to lose a child, Dad? To know you can't protect them anymore?" Henry swallowed hard. "I do now." Silence filled the room again, heavy, broken. After a while, Daniel lowered his head, his shoulders slumped. "I can't raise him, Dad. I've lost too much already. I've made too many mistakes. What could I possibly give him?" Henry stood slowly, his legs stiff but steady. He walked over, placing a trembling hand on his son's shoulder. "You give him what I couldn't give you. Time, love, a chance." Daniel closed his eyes, the tears finally falling. He turned, and for the first time in 20 years, father and son embraced. The hug was rough, awkward, but real. Years of anger melted into grief, into something close to forgiveness. When they pulled apart, Henry looked into his son's eyes. "You're not alone anymore. Neither of us are. That boy, he's not just your son. He's our second chance." Daniel nodded, wiping his face. "I don't know if I can do it." Henry's voice steadied. "Then we'll do it together." Through the glass, Noah stirred. His small hand reached up in the air, as if searching for something unseen. And in that moment, both men understood. The past couldn't be erased. The years couldn't be returned. Emily couldn't come back, but Noah was here. And for Henry and Daniel, that was enough reason to try again. The days after the accident blurred together. Paperwork, phone calls, arrangements. It was all a storm of responsibility. But in the middle of that storm was Noah, the tiny child who had survived when everything else had been lost. Henry Walker found himself at the hospital every day, sitting by the crib, watching Noah's chest rise and fall, counting every breath like it was a treasure. He had thought his life was finished. He had thought his cabin in the woods would be his last home, and silence his last companion. But now, everything felt different. Daniel was there too. At first he kept his distance, lingering in the hallway, speaking only when necessary. He looked broken, like a man who didn't know if he had the right to stand by his own son's bedside. But slowly, as the days passed, he stepped closer. He started asking questions about Noah's care. He started sitting in the chair beside Henry instead of across the room. One night, Henry caught him leaning over the crib, whispering something to the sleeping boy. It wasn't much, just a promise that he would try, but it was enough. When the doctors finally said Noah was strong enough to leave, the weight of responsibility hit Henry harder than ever. Standing at the nurse's desk, signing release papers, he realized the truth. He wasn't going back to an empty cabin anymore. He was going back with the child. On the drive home, Daniel sat in the passenger seat, cradling Noah carefully. The winding mountain road looked different this time. Not as lonely, not as dark. No one spoke for a long while. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and Noah's soft breathing. Then Daniel broke the silence. "Do you really think we can do this?" he asked. Henry kept his eyes on the road. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we have to. He deserves that much." Daniel looked down at his son, then back at his father. His lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, he nodded. The cabin looked the same as it always had: weathered wood, moss on the roof, the smell of pine thick in the air. But when Henry carried Noah inside for the first time, something shifted. The silence that had haunted the rooms for 2 decades wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't suffocating. It was waiting. Shadow, the German shepherd who had found Noah at the crash site, was lying on the porch when they arrived. The dog stood immediately, ears perked, tail stiff. When Henry stepped forward with the baby, Shadow sniffed carefully, then sat back down at the old man's feet, as if he understood this was his duty now too. Daniel chuckled softly. "Guess he's not going anywhere." Henry glanced at the dog, then at the baby in his arms. His voice was quiet. "He did what I couldn't do that night. He saved him." Daniel didn't argue. He only reached out, scratching the dog behind the ears. The first nights were the hardest. Noah cried often, waking at strange hours. Henry struggled with bottles and blankets, fumbling like a man decades out of practice. Daniel tried, but he wasn't much better. More than once, they ended up sitting together at the kitchen table at 3 a.m., both exhausted, passing the boy back and forth. But in those moments, something grew between them. The walls built from 20 years of silence started to crumble. Not all at once, but brick by brick. One night, while Noah finally slept, Daniel broke the quiet. "I used to think you hated me," he said, staring at the floor. "That night when you told me to get out, I believed every word. I thought I'd never matter to you again." Henry sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I hated myself, Daniel, not you. But I didn't know how to say it, and the longer I waited, the harder it got. I let 20 years slip away." Daniel lifted his eyes, filled with regret. "And now Emily's gone." Henry's throat tightened. "Yes, and I'll never forgive myself for missing all those years with her. But we still have Noah, and I won't make the same mistake twice." Daniel nodded, tears in his eyes, as the weeks turned into months. The cabin transformed. Toys appeared in the living room. A crib stood in the corner where old boxes used to gather dust. The fireplace that once burned for one man now warmed 3 generations. Henry often found himself watching Daniel with Noah. Clumsy, but trying, he saw a piece of the boy he had once raised, hidden beneath the scars of time, and he realized that, just maybe, they could rebuild. One evening, Henry sat on the porch with Shadow lying at his feet. Noah played on a blanket nearby, babbling nonsense while Daniel watched. The sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and gold. Henry leaned back, breathing in the crisp air. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing on him. Instead, he felt something lighter, something that had been missing for so long he barely recognized it. Not fragile anymore, not small, but steady. Life wasn't perfect. The bills were still there. The cabin still creaked with age. The ghosts of the past still lingered. But now, there was laughter. There were footsteps. There was a child's cry in the middle of the night that reminded Henry he wasn't alone. And when he looked at Daniel, he no longer saw just the boy who had walked away. He saw a man trying to come back. As the stars filled the sky, Henry whispered to himself, almost too soft to hear, "This isn't the end. It's the beginning." Shadow raised his head, as if agreeing. Daniel looked over at his father, and for once there was no anger in his eyes, only gratitude. And Noah, the little boy who had survived against all odds, laughed into the night.